Okay. So you got Moses, you got Joshua, then you have Jesus. I mean, really, basically. Yeah, David. David is an in between, right? Strong leaders are very important.
You know your mic was off, right?
Yeah, I'm not pulling it. Just go.
Well, all the mics were singing were off.
What?
When you were singing, all the mics were off.
Oh, that's good. We did that on purpose. All mics are off, and we weren't on, too. We don't stream until after we're done singing. Yeah, we don't want to scare anybody. All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Friendship Bible. This is Thursday night Bible study. Deep calls to deep, and we are in our final week of Judges. Judges chapter 21. It's been a great study. The Lord has really blessed, right? And you guys have been an amazing group of students. So it's been great to turn out here and to turn out at home for those watching at home as well. It's been really, really good. The response has been excellent. So we're going to finish tonight. Next week, Pastor George is going to pick it up with 1 Peter. So he's going to go through the book of 1 and 2 Peter with us. Okay, looking forward to that study. It's quite a blessing. I can't wait. It's been a while since I've been in Peter. I've been in a deep study of Peter myself. So that was a great choice, Pastor George.
Also known as the Big Galoot.
The Big Galoot, that's right. I tell you what, that fisherman could write pretty well. You know, he writes some really, really good stuff we're going to get into. So I'm really looking forward to that. And then it looks like I am 99% sure we're going to do Revelation after 1st and 2nd Peter. All right? So it actually is fitting. So what I'm hoping is before I do Revelation, the Lord takes us anyway. So, but if we're still here in about 6 months, then it might even be more fitting to do Revelation. We might see some more signs of the end. Right? So, all right, let's go to the Lord in prayer before we begin tonight's study and ask His blessing. Dear Heavenly Father, just thank you for this faithful group who comes out on Thursday nights to learn your word, and those at home as well who tune in and who just love your word. And it's just such an encouragement when you're surrounded by people who are just biblical enthusiasts like myself. And we just love your word, and we love studying these things. As odd and as strange it can be in the book of Judges, we've been blessed by the lessons that you are teaching us, Lord. So open up our hearts and minds tonight for those here and those who are at home, and bless tonight's study. Make me clear and concise with the things I share tonight, and answer the questions and all those questions that each one may have in their minds as they read chapter 21. So bless tonight's study. I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Judges chapter 21. Before I begin, we'll do our usual review of last week, Judges chapter 20. Last week we studied the Benjaminite War, which was just another odd and sad story added to a list of similar odd and sad stories that we've come across throughout the book of Judges. After the infamous, at least to us, right, the infamous Levite now, right? Everybody will always remember that Levite, the infamous cold-hearted Levite, ritually, right, like a high priest would, he ritually cut his dead concubine to pieces and sent a piece to each tribe. And as rumors spread like wildfire about what happened in Gibeah, all of the tribes of Israel, minus Benjamin, of course, gathered as one man in Mizpah. Now, they wanted the Levites' firsthand account of what really happened in Gibeah. Well, after hearing his story, all 11 tribes decide to wage war against the tribe of Benjamin. War was inevitable, but as a last-ditch effort, the tribe sent emissaries to Benjamin, asking them to hand over these worthless fellows, these sons of Belial. The tribe of Benjamin refused. But I think it wasn't because they were justifying the actions of these men, but rather because they saw the other tribes as meddling in their business. Added to this was the fact that the 11 tribes had gathered in force and were making demands. The Benjamites would have chafed at this type of imposed outside interference. That would have been a problem for them. That's how they would have saw it. So it would be war. Now, using the hilly terrain as a sort of home field advantage, the Benjamites dug in and waited for the Israelite army to attack. No doubt, they stationed those 700 deadly stone slingers in optimal positions around the battlefield, right? Those deadly stone slingers, right? They could hit a hair at a distance, right? 1 pound stone going about 90 miles an hour. They were deadly accurate. So I would have placed them, and I know that they did, in these great positions right around the battlefield. The tribe of Benjamin was already known for its fighting prowess besides, but also the terrain would not allow, in case you're wondering, how did this occur? They had 400,000, but see, the terrain would not allow all 400,000 to attack the city at once, but would have required them to attack in smaller groups, literally funneling them into the city. As a result of this, the Israelite army lost 40,000 men during the first 2 non-consecutive days of battle. Remember, these occurred one battle, and maybe a week later, the next battle occurred. These weren't consecutive days. This caused the defeated men to travel north to Bethel. There they fasted and made burnt and peace offerings to the capital L-O-R-D. And Ro, this is your question. The capital L-O-R-D meant that the sacrifices were to Jehovah or Yahweh, not some other, not to Baal or maybe some mix of gods. They did offer offerings to the Lord himself. The Lord answered the men, who now properly humbled themselves before God and spoke through Phinehas, the high priest. The Lord said, "Go up, for I will deliver them into your hand." Now, along with promised victory from the Lord, the Israelite commanders decided on a new strategy. They would approach Gibeah in the same manner as the first 2 days. So it would look exactly alike as Battle 1 and Battle 2. But they counted on the fact that the Benjamites, upon seeing the same foolish tactics from day 1 and 2, and feeling supremely confident, wishing to inflict a great slaughter, they were hoping that the Benjamites would pursue them far away from the city of Gibeah. So the Israelite retreat was a trap, as a band of 10,000 soldiers attacked the city as soon as the main Benjamite army was far enough away from Gibeah. These men in ambush went into Gibeah and struck it with the edge of the sword, killing men, women, children, and animals. They also burned the city with fire to produce large billows of smoke as a signal to their main army. With the trap sprung, the main army turned back on the Benjamite pursuers and fought with renewed vigor. Looking back and seeing the smoke coming from Gibeah, the Benjamite army panicked, knowing that they'd been tricked. They fled in the direction of the wilderness. Only 600 men made it to a place called the Rock of Ramon. Now, before I move on, you're going to see up here, I don't know how well you can see it, but in the purple is the Rock of Ramon. They think it's up by Bethel, a little bit north. So they fled east and north. Some people have it a little bit further south, but they travel east this way, direction of my finger. Okay? So they made it to a place called Rock of Ramon. That's where they possibly think it is. There they remained hidden for 4 months. Now, we ended in verse 48 with the Israelite army traveling throughout the cities of Benjamin and killing all the people and animals and burning those cities with fire. And by the time they were done, those 600 men at the Rock of Ramon were the only ones left from the tribe of Benjamin. Now, I will say this. More than likely, there were some Benjamites left. For example, the very, very young and the elderly. And I want you to get the picture that they took all these babies and smashed their head upon rocks. Maybe most of the very, very small babies were probably adopted into their own families and kept alive. There's a possibility of that. And some of the elderly. And the reason why that's a possibility is the purpose here was not to kill every single Benjamite, but actually and it doesn't make it any better, right? It doesn't make it more right here. But the idea is they were to kill everybody of childbearing age, okay, and wipe out all of the Benjamites that were of that age. That was the idea. So maybe the very young and the elderly were left. In tonight's study, we're going to look at chapter 21 and see the repercussions of this rash and what I consider spiritually ignorant behavior of these Israelites. So what occurred after these incidents? So that's what we're going to find in chapter 21. So turn in your Bibles to chapter 21. What's that? Slowly and carefully. They might have left it up to the Benjamites who we're going to study in this chapter. I'm sure that all 11 tribes didn't bury everyone right away, at least. All right, chapter 21. Let's see what happens next. I'm going to read the first 12 verses, all right? Follow along, first 12 verses.
Thank God that He preserved 600.
Yes. Right. Because it could have ended up in disaster, right? You know the Lord's hand was in that. Now the men of Israel had sworn in Mizpah, saying, none of us shall give his daughter to Benjamin in marriage. Right? So verse 1, we answer your question, right, Annabelle? So the people came to Bethel and sat there before God until evening and lifted up their voices and wept bitterly. They said, why, O Lord God of Israel, has this come about in Israel so that one tribe should be missing today in Israel? And it came about the next day that the people arose early and built an altar there and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. Then the sons of Israel said, who is there among the tribes of Israel who did not come up in the assembly to the Lord? For they had taken a great oath concerning him who did not come to the Lord at Mizpah, saying, he shall surely be put to death. And the sons of Israel were sorry for their brother Benjamin and said, one tribe is cut off from Israel today. What shall we do for wives for those who are left, since we have sworn by the Lord not to give them any of our daughters in marriage? And they said, what one is there of the tribes of Israel who did not come up to the Lord at Mizpah? And behold, no one had come to the camp from Jabesh Gilead to the assembly. For when the people were numbered, behold, not one of the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead was there. And the congregation sent 12,000 of the valiant warriors there and commanded them, saying, go and strike the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead with the edge of the sword, with the women and the little ones. This is the thing that you shall do. You shall utterly destroy every man and every woman who has lain with a man. And they found among the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead 400 young virgins who had not known a man by lying with him. And they brought them to the camp at Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan. Chapter 21 starts in a time shortly after the destruction of all the Benjamite city. Okay, and we discussed it at the very end last time, that they went and they destroyed all the cities, the Benjamite cities inside their territory, right? Killing men, women, children, animals. The heat of the battle began to cool here, and the 11 tribes had to think about what they had just done. They were victorious, but realization set in as they reflected on what their actions meant for the future of Israel. All right, they're feeling some amount of guilt. They were going to be responsible for the extermination of one whole tribe in Israel. After all, the Benjamites were their own brothers, their blood relatives. And even though the tribe of Benjamin was responsible for their part in the war, as they protected men who committed lewd sexual acts that were downright evil and behaved like the men of Sodom, the 11 realized that maybe they had gone too far. Right? You think? Maybe we shouldn't have gone this far, right? Before moving to verse 1, I wanted to take time to review the importance of oaths and vows made in God's name to the people of ancient times. It was literally unthinkable to break an oath or a vow once it was made or crossed the person's lips, even amongst the heathens. They believed in divine consequences for the individual that broke a vow or an oath. For those of you a little bit, just to go off on a side note for about oaths and vows. Now, I'm going to use the term oath and vows in this section synonymously, okay? But there is a technical difference between an oath and a vow. So if you put your hand on the Bible before your testimony, in a trial, all right, you're making an oath. So the oath is that you're going to be reasonable, that you're going to be telling the truth, right? That you're going to help a fellow man by being honest. And then you do that before God. So oaths are generally between two people groups. They make an oath and they do it before the Lord. A vow is generally something you don't do, or the Nazirite vow, for example, you're not going to cut your hair, you're not going to drink wine, and this is a solemn promise that you make to God. Either way, both an oath and a vow is a solemn promise, right, that are made before God, and it changes the behavior of the vower or the oath taker, right? So I want to use them synonymously, but if you do a study of oaths and vows, there is going to be a little bit of a difference. Everybody understand? Okay, there's a little technical difference. But God deals with both oaths and vows equally here. So the ancient Israelites and even the ancient peoples of this time would go to great lengths not to break an oath or not to break a vow. It was just, they believed, all of them, even if they were heathens, they believed in divine consequence. So you try to avoid it at all costs. Just like some other cultural things, he said they want to avoid these certain things. And breaking a vow is another no-no. You don't want to do that. So these consequences were usually devastating and sometimes thought to be permanent, at least in their minds. Devastating, and that they're permanent curses that come upon people who break vows. So there is no Israelite who would ever take either an oath or a vow without the deepest reverence. We don't think that way because oaths and vows are really not important in our culture. Do we have oaths and vows? We do. But if you look at them as level of importance, compared to these ancient times, they're not as important to us. They're just not. We make them. We have them, but they were much more deeply important for the people of this time. We just make them in general, and we flippantly say things like, I swear to goodness, which is really a Christian way of saying I swear to God, right? And we use that kind of verbiage when we make vows. And it's, these are just sayings that we flippantly use. But these two expressions just indicate to others, right, when we say them, that we were honestly telling the truth. I swear to goodness I'm telling the truth. So it's definitely a different level here than the time of the judges or any ancient time. So the point is that in Old Testament times, a vow was sacred and people would go to great lengths not to break them. Sometimes these oaths and vows got God's people in trouble. And if you read enough of the Old Testament, you'll find instances. And here's one. That is why God began to regulate vows in the law of Moses. Here are just the first two verses of Numbers chapter 30. So if you want to do a deeper review of oaths and vows, you just go to Numbers chapter 30, and you have a whole chapter. The whole chapter is dedicated to oaths and vows. But here's just the first two verses, just to give us an idea of what it was like and what the law established. It says in Numbers chapter 30, verse 1, Then Moses spoke to the heads of the tribes of the sons of Israel, saying, "This is the word which the Lord has commanded. If a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath to bind himself with a binding obligation, he shall not violate his word. He shall do it according to all that proceeds out of his mouth." So if you were a Jew, you were not allowed to break an oath or a vow once you made them. Okay, that's why they became very dangerous. That's why God had to step in and regulate them, because they could get out of hand. Oaths and vows were overseen by God to help his people to avoid such pitfalls that we're going to study in chapter 21. All right? So everybody got it? There's going to be a few of these oaths made. Most of the 3 oaths, they're oaths. They're not really vows. They're oaths that they made before God. So there are more oaths than vows in this chapter, but we'll see vows in other chapters as well. So this is why in Matthew 5:37, Jesus reveals a kingdom principle that you should simply let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no, right? Remember that? All right? And in Matthew chapter 5, they're kingdom principles that the Lord's establishing. And usually what he did in chapter 5, in those chapters, is he goes further than, what the law says. All right? These are kingdom principles. These are expanding on or expounding on truths. So when it comes to vows to Jesus, make your yes, yes, and your no, no. Avoid them at all costs. All right? So that's in Matthew 5:37. So to the text, verse 1. Verse 1, we are now informed that the 400,000 that gathered at Mizpah had made a series of vows before the Lord. Actually, he made a series of oaths, to be technical. In chapter 20, verse 8, they vowed or oathed not to go home to their families until the war was over and those wicked men of Gibeah were brought to justice. That was an oath. That was a vow made before the Lord, right? This would have been a standard vow for war, especially if they considered this holy war. But verse 1 mentions a vow they made at Mizpah. That must have sounded good at the time, but now is causing a major dilemma now that they have decided to help the tribe of Benjamin to repopulate. They vowed that they would not allow any of their daughters to marry any Benjamite. It's almost as if they knew the lengths that they were willing to take against Benjamin before the war even began. You know what I mean by that? Certainly if they were going to depopulate Benjamin and go to war against him, it wasn't just a matter of trying to get the men who were guilty, right, and bringing them to justice. It seems to be a plan at Mizpah that they already made, that when they kill most of the Benjamites, whatever men were left, they weren't going to give their daughters as wives. So it seems like that there was already a plan in their minds to wipe them out. Anyway, just an observation I made. It doesn't say it, but it seems like they had already planned that. It reminds me of how large gatherings and mobs can influence each other into all kinds of violent behaviors simply because the individuals feed off each other, right? They feed off each other. So you have a person or a group of people who go to a rally for one purpose, and the crowd riles them all up, and the next thing you know, they're doing things they normally wouldn't have done if they were in a smaller group. And that's what this gathering at Mizpah reminds me. Now, more is coming up in this chapter, right? Like they made these oaths. They were definitely going a little too far. The problem was that with only 600 men left in the tribe of Benjamin, and with none of their daughters available to give to them in marriage for childbearing, they had no way to ensure that the tribe would survive. And again, it was with heavy hearts. They were very sorry for what they did, but it's with heavy hearts that they pondered about how they were responsible for killing off one of their own brothers, and that one of Jacob's sons would lose their inheritance in the land. Now, I don't know if you've ever studied or know anything about a levirate marriage, A levirate marriage was an example of how important it was that individual family inheritance was not lost in the land. So the levirate marriage is, I die and I don't have a son or an heir, then my brother is to take my widow, marry her, and the first child that they have would be considered my son, right? And he would get my inheritance. So that's a levirate marriage. We see that right in the Gospels where they ask Jesus, right? If it happens 7 times, right? In heaven, you know, whose husband or whose wife would she be out of the 7? So yeah, that's basic. And you know, the levirate marriage is not just a Jewish thing. It's an ancient thing. It's a Middle Eastern idea here. So more than one, you know, other Middle Eastern countries have done this. But the idea here for Israel is that each family was so important to God that they would get an inheritance. The daughters of Zelophehad, right? They got inheritance for their father who had no sons. So the bottom line is, if these 11 tribes were responsible for destroying all of Benjamin, right? And God cares about not only one single tribe, he cares about the individual families. And think about what they've done here. They're not just destroying one family or one inheritance or one piece of property. They're destroying a whole territory for the Benjamites. So they have no inheritance, and you know, unfortunately, it's a little bit too late. So we studied before with tribalism, individual tribes usually avoided cutting off bloodlines at all costs because of this idea of keeping bloodlines alive. It is why a tribal war can end so abruptly in the Middle East, leaving our military leaders shocked and caught off guard. It's happened in the past. One tribe just decided that they were unwilling to cut off the bloodlines of an enemy tribe. And that's why we go into Afghanistan and we back one tribe, and instead of annihilating and destroy that army, they decide they're not willing to do it. Because when push comes to shove, tribalism has a sacred, you know, duty not to cut off certain bloodlines. So they decide they're not that mad at them after all. They stop fighting, and we're wondering what is going on here. And they make peace. And lots of times it's just simply because they're unwilling to cut off bloodlines. So with this burden in heart and mind, these men traveled to Bethel to repent and offer sacrifices to the Lord. They wept before the Lord in remorse for their actions. It's a little too late. But I think we can give them an answer to the question they asked in verse 3. They asked, "Why, O Lord, God of Israel, has this come about in Israel, so that one tribe should be missing today in Israel?" They were trying to understand why God would allow such a thing to happen in Israel. But it was their own rash and spiritually ignorant behavior that caused the dire situation. I think we can answer that question for them, right? God was allowing these men to wrestle and deal with the consequences of their actions. And just like them during the period of Judges, he does the same thing to us at times to teach us a lesson that we desperately need to learn. How many times have you said words that you wish you could take back? You haven't done that a ton of times. Now, there are people who have to take back actions, right? And we may have been there too as well. But just concentrating on the words where you've said something, you did something, and you can't take it back, and boy, it's out there now, and you regret it. So you might say, well, why did God allow that to happen in the first place? Because all these A, B, and C, and D occurred because I committed those acts or said that thing, right? Why did God allow that? And sometimes God allows us to deal with the consequences of our actions. And I think that's what's happening here. Why doesn't God step in and say, what are you doing? What have you done? So we do it ourselves. We wish we could take things back, but you know, lots of times once it's done, it's done. Also, I want you to keep in mind that behind the scenes, there is an angelic conflict. And I have not brought this out a lot in this study. We haven't talked about the angelic conflict. But one of the things that I think is important to remember is that Satan and his angels are working behind the scenes constantly. It is the unseen war that often rages behind the physical events. And Satan wants nothing more than to destroy God's chosen people, right? The annihilation of one tribe out of 13, I think Satan would take that as a win. And so there's so much more that's going on behind the scenes. The influence of evil. Satan's working. Anyway, funny enough, as bad as they've behaved, they absolutely would not break this vow of allowing their daughters to marry and reproduce with the Benjamites. They would not break that vow or that oath. So they had to come up with another solution. The solution came starting in verse 5, attached to a third vow that they made at Mizpah. They vowed that any tribe or clan that didn't answer the call to assemble for war, that tribe or clan would be killed. And that's not an individual. Even it says, it sounds like an individual when you first start reading it. It's not individual. They're looking for a group, a tribe, a clan who may not have answered the call of duty here. Not any individuals. So after some discussion, they determined that the men of Jabesh Gilead were the ones who had not answered the call. Now, Jabesh Gilead, real quick, is if you follow the yellow line up and to the east. All right? Everybody see where that's going, the yellow line? And Jabesh Gilead is on the east side of the Jordan. We talked about Gilead. Gilead is the Transjordan area. That's the eastern side of the Jordan. Manasseh and Gad. I think the history shows that Manasseh pretty much controlled that territory and area. But it's up there where Gad's territory is as well. So Gilead is kind of a combination generally of the Transjordan. Sometimes it's those two tribes combined. I think Jabesh is in Manasseh, East Manasseh. You might look on some map and it might have Gad. Depends on how the maps are. But you understand when you look at Bible maps, you have to move the lines a little bit. For example, Bethel is really originally given to Benjamin, but history shows that the Ephraimites controlled Bethel. It was a border town right there, and Benjamin never really took control of Bethel. So Ephraim actually held that city. So really tough when you look at Bible maps. Well, these 11 tribes are going from bad to worse, because we're going to find they've painted themselves into, to use a modern term, painted themselves into a corner. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. So what they did is they got together, they did a roll call, and they realized nobody from Jabesh Gilead came to Mizpah. The only city out of all the 11 tribes, just one. This town was called Jabesh. There was more than one Jabesh in the land. That's what they usually do. Jabesh was located in Gilead, which is the east side of the Jordan River. Talked about that. So that's why they call it Jabesh Gilead. All right? Gilead was the location. It's the Jabesh that existed in Gilead. Now, this oath was not just another rash promise to God. At least this one wasn't, that they ended up being forced to keep. This was a sacred oath that the tribes took seriously in order to remain united and had its beginnings under Moses and Joshua. Right? Where did we see this before? Don't cheat. Where did we see this before, where a city didn't join the battle and it was cursed? Anybody remember? I had to look it up too. In the Song of Deborah.
It was another group on the other side of Jordan, right? Wasn't it another?
Marotes?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they don't know where that, remember we were discussing, we're not really sure where that is. Possibly far to the north. Right? So in the Song of Deborah, Judges 5:23, going back, curse Maros, said the angel of the Lord. Utterly curse its inhabitants, because they did not come to the help of the Lord to the help of the Lord against the warriors. That's from the Song of Deborah. Studied that way back in lesson 6, chapter 5. The Lord himself rebuked the town of Meroz for not answering the call of Deborah and Barak. So when you look at that, you may be of the opinion, and I know some scholars out there were of the opinion, that in our current case, these 11 tribes were a little misguided. It wasn't the same as, making it parallel to Deborah and Barak. All right, there's a little question about should they have been doing what they've been doing in this chapter, right? So they seem to be a little misguided, but it was a sacred duty to join the battle, and that was very, very important. So I might give them a slide on this oath a little bit. Of these last 3 chapters are early. As a matter of fact, these last 3 chapters probably occurred during a time, probably Othniel was still alive during this time. Yeah, just probably within a decade of Joshua's death that this occurred. No more than 2. So if we take both appendices, we take the first 2, that was probably within maybe 2 decades, maybe 20 to maybe up to 50 or 60 years after the death of Joshua, using that as a gauge. This here could be as close as, a decade or possibly no more than 2. This happened very, very early. And a lot of the argument is because see how they came together, right? They were called together, and we know it didn't take long for these tribes to be so separate, right, to be studied, that there's no way that they could gather anybody as one man. So there was a couple of reasons. That's one of the reasons why this is a very early date. Also, we have Phineas is still alive. So we have a very, very early date here, which is part of the point of the author because we're seeing major issues already in the time of Judges. I mean, we've looked at later time as we've marched through the time of Judges. But now we're coming all the way back to the beginning and seeing that there's problems very early on. And I'm sure even the readers during the time of the kings, as they read these things, they would understand that, boy, this is a really crazy time, a very lawless time period in Israel's history. And so, it's very, very early time period here. So I'm going to give them a pass on this last oath. But an argument can be made that this was the most sober oath of the 3. Jabesh would have been seen as traitors to Israel and to God because they didn't answer the call. So they sent an attack team of 12,000 soldiers to Jabesh. All right, the yellow line, they traveled all the way up east, across the Jordan, right, north and east. And they put Jabesh under the law of Harem, or what we have called the ban. All right, so a very Jewish Hebrew word is harem, the law of harem. All right, we call it the ban. In verse 11, the Hebrew word used for utterly destroyed is harem, the word harem. This is the thing that you shall do. You shall harem. You shall utterly destroy every man, right? That's, so harem is another word for the ban. Harem means to destroy something for the purpose of dedicating it to God. It is a term having to do with holy war. This is holy war. It's not any because they talk about the Middle East holy war, and it's a borrowed expression, which kind of gives it out of context. We're not talking about the holy war, the jihad that's practiced in the Middle East. This is God-ordained war that God ordains. The spoils of war, including the people, animals, even precious metals, are destroyed with fire. All these spoils, no Israelite is allowed to partake of what God has banned. That's what happened in what city? Jericho. Jericho was under the ban. Who took spoils? Achan. Very good. Good memory. Achan. Okay? And he was punished. Matter of fact, all Israel was under punishment until they found out who it was that took the spoils. So Jericho was under the ban. They were to go in, destroy the city, and destroy everything in it. Light it on fire, and that was it. They were not allowed to take anything out of that city. So we have this idea here. And all of this has to do with the eradication of evil. Because once evil takes root, it's nearly impossible to remove. And it's very important for a believer to understand that. Because the ban to others who are not spiritually discerning, the ban does not mean that God is somehow cosmically mean and is misunderstood by critics, right? This idea of banning who have no spiritual gauge. That's the people who are confused about it. So, the idea of the ban is really to get rid of evil. So, the question is, was this attack God ordained? Right? I just don't think so. I don't see it. Did anybody else see it that way? Now, they could have went to Jabesh and they could have killed the leaders, those who were in charge.
Was their rationale because they all vowed to go to battle against Benjamin and these people didn't show up? Is that the rationale?
Right. So just to have an idea of the three vows, the three oaths, or what happens. So they come together at Mizpah, right? And they say, all right, they're all together. They decide what they're going to do. They're going to confront Benjamin. It's going to be war. Oath number 1. We're not going to go home to our families, to our homes, until this is all done, right? Number 2, anybody that doesn't show up, we're going to get them afterwards. We're going to take care of them, okay? They're going to be utterly destroyed. Oath number 2. Oath number 3, once we destroy this tribe, no matter how many men are left, we're not going to give our daughters to them in marriage. And we're going to make sure that they don't survive. So even if these men, the 600 men, did survive, by giving them wives, they lose their inheritance. The whole tribe of Benjamin lose their inheritance. You see what they're doing? They're exterminating them altogether. So besides the one for Jabesh, which I think that they had, like I said, there's some background right for them to go after them. I think a lot of what they did was rash, another rash vow, not much different than Jephthah, right? And I see it as that mob mentality. Think about it. They all came together, and if they came together and they didn't have that mob mentality, they would have found out what happened. They would have went to the Benjamites, asked for these men. When Benjamin didn't hand them over, they would have fought Benjamin like they should have, defeated Benjamin, and then brought these men to justice, and then let their brothers go home. Justice served, then they go to their own tribes. It's over, right? I mean, easiest to say from my end. But if you look at it in a level-head perspective, that's something they could have done. They probably would have went to war with Benjamin. War was unavoidable. Benjamin was refusing to give these men up. And it's apparent that the Lord wanted these men to be killed and brought to justice. It was important. This wicked, lewd act that they committed needed to be punished and taken care of. So I don't see anything that they did wrong up until that point. But having this mob mentality, also taking a good look at the culture of the time, being these swears, and they just frivolously threw these oaths out there. And now that they've, in anger and being stirred up, they've literally just about destroyed their brothers, and now they feel sorry. And, what does it remind you of? Like somebody who is emotionally, right, unstable, right? They're so highs and lows. They're all gung-ho. They've made all these promises before God, saying they're not going to break these oaths. Yet they're doing a host of all these other things wrong. But boy, they won't break those oaths, no matter what, because they made them before the Lord. It's very, very hard in this chapter to determine, because it's kind of, you're not supposed to break an oath before the Lord. But hey, maybe they shouldn't have made them in the first place, right? And I just think that they got there, they got themselves all riled up, they heard the story, and from here on out, they've made some really bad choices. And now they're stuck because they're not going to break any of these oaths. Everybody understand the 3 oaths?
It's like somebody who signs a contract and a week later thinks, what in the world did I
Right.
And they're feeling bad about it, but there really isn't, they have to find a back door to solve it.
Right. We're going to talk about that because this is what they end up doing, right? Very good. I put it like this, the next line, up at the top of the 4th page. They are just like a liar who has to continue to lie in order to cover their tracks, right? Person lies, what happens? They lie again. They lie to cover the first lie, and and it continues. So that was kind of the example I was given as well. I was giving you guys. It's just like a liar who continues to cover the tracks. They honestly, I mean, you think about it, they may have seen this as an act of piety. It was a pious act. And fooled themselves, thinking somehow they were pleasing to God. And I would charge them with acts of extremism. Either way, they must have decided to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. This is what they do. 2 birds, 1 stone. First, they killed all the inhabitants of Jabesh in order to satisfy vow number 3. At the same time, they solved the problem of getting wives for the 600 Benjaminite men without breaking their vow from verse 1. They're wheeling and dealing, right? You see, the men of Jabesh never went to Mitzpah, so they made no such vow. Thus, their women were free. You see the thinking here? Their women were free to be married. There was no such vow made by Jabesh. In the end, this is what they were doing. Like you said, Pastor George, they're satisfying one vow in order to circumvent another. That doesn't sound like piety to me, right? Good evidence that this isn't pious at all.
Sounds like something we would do.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I'm sure if we look back in our own history personally, we've done things like this all the time, right? Bargained with the Lord, right? Yeah, it's a defense mechanism. So at this point in time, yeah, we've seen this before. I mean, it's human nature, right? So that's basically what they're doing. They're satisfying one vow, they're circumventing another. So they spared 400 young virgins from the destruction of Jabesh and took them to Shiloh. Now, they probably went to Shiloh because now the Benjamites were taken care of, right? They've already destroyed the cities in Benjamin, and their new base of operations was moved out of Benjamite territory and into the territory of Ephraim, which was Joshua's tribe. So you're wondering why now all of a sudden they're in Shiloh. They probably moved their base of operations north and out of Benjamin's territory. The rest of the chapter takes place in Shiloh, the city where the wilderness tabernacle will reside for the remainder of the time of the judges. And a couple of different things about, as you read through this chapter, just general information you're going to see during this time. When it says that they made a vow or an oath before the Lord, it generally was done before the Ark of the Covenant. It did not necessarily mean that the tabernacle, the full tabernacle, had to be there. And we see they made an oath before the Lord at Mitzpah, which has probably meant that they brought the ark down there with Phinehas and the high priests. All right? And then we see them going to Bethel, right, and making sacrifices. It could have been that the wilderness tabernacle was in Bethel at this point in time still, or they brought the Ark of the Covenant up there, or possibly now that we see that Shiloh, they moved it up to Shiloh. They did a whole move of the wilderness tabernacle, or it has been there. They just moved the ark, okay? So we get a lot of that in this chapter. And we see that they're going to get in trouble for that, right? Because what happens in the beginning of 1 Samuel?
Putting it on a cart?
What did they do in 1 Samuel with the Philistines before they put it in the cart? They took it, and they brought it to the battlefield.
And it was a lack of piety for real.
Right.
You know, they thought that if
With that
they
in
would have
front.
took it with that in front, there's no way they were going to lose. And it was the wrong fit. Like, they didn't have real faith. And so the Philistines stole the ark.
They took the ark, right.
That's a fun story.
Yeah, they lost the ark. It's the next story if you want to continue in your own personal reading and read through 1 Samuel. You go right in there, right?
Dagon fell,
Fell, yeah.
Where the ark went,
they had boils and
But this whole story happens because they're fiddling around with the ark, and they shouldn't have been doing that in the first place.
right.
They end up bringing it here, bringing it there, instead of leaving it in the Holy of Holies, right? It should have been in the Holy of Holies.
Consecrate the ark as holy.
Right.
You know, it's the similar thing as when Moses hit the rock. You
Right.
know, it's really along the same vein there.
Yeah, and it's the actually traditional definition of the word profane. Taking that which is holy and making it common.
Right.
Because nobody was supposed to see the ark, right?
No.
Just the high priest once a year, right?
It really should have remained in the Holy of Holies. They got into a pattern of what I'm saying here is of taking the ark. Yeah. And then eventually in the battle with the Philistines, which happens at the end of Judges, very beginning of 1 Samuel, they bring it to battle and lose it, right? And so, yeah. Right. Right? Instead of the sacred, they treat it as secular, right? Yeah, some sort of rabbit's foot. So there isn't. So if it's before the Lord, it's possible that Shiloh was the wilderness tabernacle, or the wilderness tabernacle was at this point in time, or it might have been in Bethel, and they eventually, just after this, they bring it into Shiloh. We're not really sure. But base of operations moved to Shiloh, so now our setting is up there. Before we move on, and before I read the rest of the chapter and finish, Judges, this is it. Does anybody have any questions in the first 12 verses or any comments? Something we haven't.
What tribe were the people from Jabesh Gilead from?
They're from the tribe of Manasseh. Now, on the eastern side of Jordan, there's Gad and Manasseh. Now, you see, like, for example, if I look at my Ryder Study Bible, I'll go to the back, and I look where it says Jabesh, it says Gad. So Gilead was generally for the whole eastern side or Transjordan area. But usually Reuben down south was left out, and Gilead would mean Gad and Manasseh. And because of blurred lines of inheritance, those lines moved. I think history shows that Manasseh was the more likely tribe who were in charge of Jabesh Gilead. But there could have been Gadites. It was right there in between their territory. Yeah. So it doesn't have it. It just has Gilead because that's kind of like the area of Gilead. Down here below her would be Gad, and as you get further up, you have Manasseh. All right? Any other questions about where we're going?
So how can so in Deborah, the city that did not go to the battle,
Right.
that battle was not against their own people. That battle was against the Canaanites, right?
Right, but they were involved. They must have been a city that was in one of the territories involved, and they didn't answer the call, and they were cursed by the angel of the Lord, which is a pre-incarnate Christ, right? So they did not help their fellow countrymen. Now, because they gathered as one man, all 11 tribes, as one, that unity was very important. And if somebody would argue with me and say that they had the right to go and do what they did to Jabesh, I wouldn't be able to really strongly argue against that, even though I think this chapter is littered with all their mistakes that they made and probably just a little overzealousness, and they've kind of gone overboard here. I don't think they were spiritually discerning and doing the right thing. But there is an idea that Jabesh did not join the battle, and that was a big no-no. You know, so.
That was part of the, commands for the Joshua conquest is when we're going about, you need to call them.
Right.
And,
Yeah, the only argument against that you could make was all this necessary and authorized. I mean, you could make an argument that the 11 tribes should have gathered, made a decision to bring those men to justice, and they would have had to fight. Remember, they would have had to fight Benjamin. Benjamin wasn't going to give those men up, and they would have had to fight a battle. Yep. Win the battle, go home. Make sure that justice was done, evil was ridden the land, and then it would have been over, Now, if that was the story, and then we hear that they went to Jabesh Gilead and defeated that and brought like some of their leaders to justice or something happened there, I probably would say these men did great. They probably didn't do anything wrong, couldn't find anything they did wrong. If it was just that, but we see all these other things.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. How come the priesthood let these guys make this vow without saying, nowhere in Scripture talks about us declaring war on a tribe
Yep.
and exterminating a tribe. You know,
I remember, we've talked about the priesthood being bankrupt, right? Right?
it's still early, though.
It is, but Phineas is a very, very strong leader. But I would think at this point in time, Phineas is very, very old.
And I was thinking about the idea that from this story, one of the principles that bubbles up here is for us to be very careful before we give our word about something. Like we're going to do something. Because there's always consequences, and we have to be very careful of seeing where those consequences are going to lead, especially when we're in an emotional state. We make a vow, like
Right.
Scarlett O'Hara, I'll never be poor again. One of these things where like events have pressed you in and you've made this promise, and then all of a sudden now your whole life is kind of tied like an anchor to this thing that's going to take you to the bottom of the sea.
Right.
This was unfortunate. If there had been somebody to say, the idea of going to battle, going to battle against Canaanites,
Right.
Like I said last week, what did the law require? The law required taking those people, not even their relatives, their fathers, just those people who were involved with the infraction, and making sure that justice is meted out to them.
Right.
Not even their relatives. That's what the law said. So this is like completely anti
No, absolutely.
Mosaic law.
And I think the priesthood very early on lost their voice.
Absolutely.
I think they had no power. They had no voice. The people were not learning the scriptures.
And I'm
They were
wondering,
learning some things, but
you had mentioned jihad. The Muslims have taken a lot of scriptural ideas and twisted them around for their
Right.
own purpose. I can see them looking at a passage like this and say, when we declare a holy war against somebody, then we're all in on it.
right.
We declare jihad against somebody. Well, I mean, it's taking, and it shows us as believers how important it is for us to live in a way that's honoring to God and do the right thing all the time. Because when we do the wrong thing, those are the things that tend to get
Right.
taken away and multiplied, and all of a sudden we've got this evil in this world because believers were confused about what was right and wrong. Like for example, like when Jesus said, give me a coin, whose inscription on it? Give unto Caesar what's Caesar, unto God what's God's, and saying there's Caesar and there's God, and you got to pay Caesar, but God is different, and it's two different kingdoms, right? There's two different kingdoms there. What did the church do? The church tried to make the two kingdoms one.
Right.
Where now the church was Caesar. Well, how did that work in the Roman Empire?
Fantastic.
It was terrible. I mean, the Pope was calling for people to be executed, and we went through centuries of injustice because the church didn't take the right stand there, and it got multiplied. Now, we have to be very careful to walk in a way that's pleasing to God, because
Yeah,
it
they
gets
lost
repeated.
they lost their way.
Right.
Well, I would just say I challenge you, like read through Leviticus, read through Exodus. When I read through Judges, it was after I studied those books, and I had a real good grasp of what the law and what the Lord intended. And then I studied this, and I was like, wait, hold on, they're not supposed to be doing that. The priesthood was bankrupt. They lost their voice early. And you can see that when you read through 1st and 2nd Samuel. You can see that where David has an authorized personal priest. King David was not allowed to have that priest. If you go to the law, he was violating the law. But they didn't knew any better. Why did this man have to die? Because the Ark of the Covenant was carried on a cart. Because no priest said, David, this is not how you should carry the ark. There was not one voice priest who knew. Then the ark was brought into a city. It was Beth Shemesh, right? Wasn't it Beth Shemesh? Right? That was a Levitical city. There was all Levites, and a whole bunch of them died because they looked in the ark. They opened the lid up. They were Levites. So starting in the book of Judges, I mean, they lost their voice early. The people weren't being given the word. They weren't given their Levitical cities, so it was the other tribes. It was their fault as well.
It shows how quickly we can, really derail. You know?
Yep.
And one of the things, with the jihad and everything, and the twisting of scripture, that's why it's really important to study passages like this in a detail as you're doing, because they'll take this passage and twist it and say, oh, what we're doing is okay. But this
Right.
is not, like, you're reading the passage, and it's clear that this isn't sanctioned by the Lord.
This isn't sanctioned by the Lord,
This
that's I would
isn't
argue,
okay.
yes.
This isn't a holy war. Like, when they toss out holy war was when God said, go after
Yep.
Ai, go after Jericho, and devote them to utter destruction. That was holy because it was directed from God.
Right.
And these are man-made directives here.
Annabelle?
Why do you think people from Jabesh Gilead didn't want to fight? Could it possibly be that maybe they could see that it was wrong, the wrong thing to do, and they didn't want to get involved in that?
I know somebody had mentioned that there was close ties with Gibeah and Jabesh Gilead, but that was after the fact. We're not really necessarily sure. There's a couple of guesses out there, but not really sure why they didn't. But it could have been. It's possible.
A lot of good it did, though.
Yeah, because it's apparent that some of the other cities surrounding them, they went, right? But these men, yeah, a lot of good it did them, right? Yeah. Not
But
sure.
I mean, if I'm looking at chapter 20, verse 8, and
Right.
it says, they didn't make that oath before the Lord, they made that oath to each other. I mean, there's.
Well, but an oath is towards each other, done before the Lord.
But the thing is that it doesn't seem to me, in reading chapter 20, that the only time that they ever they really have anything to do with the Lord is when they're losing.
Yeah, you could make an argument that I'm saying that it was an oath before the Lord. I'm including it as one of the three. But you could make an argument that no, it's not an oath, it's the same. But when you make an oath, you usually make it before your God. And because they did it at Mitzvah, I am throwing that it makes sense that oath was made to the Lord, even though to the Lord is not in verse 8. They made 3 oaths to each other when they were together at Mitzvah. And that they were, and it's going to really basically drive the rest of this chapter because they refused to break those oaths. And as a result, this is kind of what happened.
But
You know?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm, excuse me, I'm not confused, but I'm like, I don't really see God in any of these oaths that they've made. I think, I mean, I agree with what Chaz was saying. Like, I don't really see this as like a holy war. I mean,
Right.
it was just a cluster.
No, it was.
Just like
But you
one
got to
big
remember that God told him to go and fight Benjamin. So God did speak through Phinehas and tell them to go up. So God was involved in some of this. That's why I would argue that God was for the punishment of these men and bringing them to justice, the men of Gibeah. All right? Benjamin created the war, and if they would have just given these men up, it would have been over. But that's probably as far as I would go
But the thing
myself.
About, like, but you were saying that they were given the oath that they were going to haram, devote to destruction, right?
Right.
But when that comes into play, the only time that is holy is when God says it.
Right.
Right?
Absolutely.
Like, we don't get to, like I see it as more of like the blood boiling, like, like, and it's that high and low type stuff, right?
Right.
But the blood's boiling, I'm angry, we're just going to devote it to
Yeah, that's what I think
because
happened.
This is what we're used to.
Right.
And so they're looking at it and they're playing the role of God here, right?
Right.
It's saying that you are so, it's like us as believers today. I'm not praying for that person. That person is like, I don't care if that person, like I've had conversations and counseling sessions with people that I just don't care if they die.
Right.
And it's like, do you realize that what you're saying is you don't care if they go to hell?
Right.
You're not willing to share the gospel. You're not, you don't get to play God here, and you don't get to make that decision, because that's final, right?
Right.
Like putting a tribe or nation under the harem, the law of harem it's got to come from God, because only God is sovereign and able enough to know what.
Absolutely.
He's doing, right?
Now, I'm not making it out like I'm backing these guys, right? I mean, I
No,
made
we know
it clear.
you're backing them. We know you're
I
backing them.
think,
No,
I
I'm
think,
clarifying
They thought in their mind that they put them under the ban.
That's what I'm saying.
Right,
That's
I
what
don't-
I'm saying. What I'm seeing happening here is this didn't come as a directive from God.
No, I agree.
Their blood's boiling. Let's put them under the ban.
Yeah, the question, yeah, this is attack God ordained. I don't think it's God ordained. I agree.
And I don't think it is either.
No. I don't think you can make a case for that either. Although people make all kinds of cases.
Yeah.
Things.
And they're wrong if
And
they
if,
don't agree with DG.
Yeah, and then,
I know. How dare they?
you could, there's,
My view is always the right
there's
view.
injustice, like you could shake a stick and always hit somebody with injustice in the story.
That is true.
You know, like you mentioned about Benjamin, if Benjamin had just delivered up the people who were involved in that thing for justice, then there wouldn't have been war.
Right.
Right, if the leaders, so like everywhere along the line, people got to be small about doing the right thing.
And
And
that's what
it
your
tells
point
us,
was. We got to do the right thing.
that's
Right.
what it tells us
There wasn't
about
good leadership.
Our personal lives. When you're in a leadership position and something's wrong and you don't say anything.
And it should have been the priesthood, right? That should have been involved and
God-
should have
that's what
said
God wants
something.
you there for, you know, to stand
Yeah.
up and stand up for what's right. And there could have been one Levite who'd said, you know, the law says, go prosecute these people.
Absolutely. That is a
And,
problem.
Maybe if you went to battle with them, instead of exterminating the tribe, say, we're going to fight a battle with you until you give these people up.
But isn't that the overall, like, that's the narrative of the whole book of Judges, is the fact that
Right.
the people of God, the Levites who are supposed to be the priesthood, have not done what they're supposed to do.
They did not.
Right? And so
Nope.
what happens when those who God puts in charge don't step up? The people perish.
Yep.
Right?
They lost their
And that's
voice
what
very
happens.
early on. It
That's what
happened,
happens
and
when
by the
churches
yeah.
don't, like, it's exactly, and that's why one of the reasons he wanted to do Judges is because of the similarities. You read Judges and you're like, man, this could have been written in 2021.
Yep. Absolutely.
Right.
All these
And the
things we're seeing
reality
it
is the
playing
church
out in
needs
our
to
own
stand
lives.
up
Yeah.
and do what's right. And it's the smaller church, you know, like, it's usually if the masses are doing one thing and then the church is doing it, which direction is the truth, right? It's usually the smaller one, right? Like, it's, you know, that's usually how it plays out.
Yep.
So,
But it was the Levite who covered up his transgression in the beginning.
right,
When-
and that's what
He
I'm
wasn't a
saying.
priest. We were talking about the
Well-
priesthood. We were talking about the Levitical priesthood.
Like, that's what I'm saying.
Those in
Like,
charge
like,
spiritually.
Those who are supposed to be in spiritual leadership are bankrupt. It messes everybody up. You can really boil it down to, Judges says everybody does what was right in their own eye, but really it starts from those whom God has put as shepherds over his people.
Yep.
When they start to do what's right in their own eye, well, the people are going to start to do what's right in their own eye, and destruction ensues.
This whole book is about a people that, or God's people that had no rudder. They lost it. And they lost their way. And I'm sure, like I said, even if you were a young king's son, you know, during the time of the kings, they used to probably read this book and have the same sort of thoughts and ideas. A very dark time in Israel's history. And that was the whole point. They needed a strong leader, right? And they didn't have one. And so this is what ends up happening. But that definitely started with the priesthood, the ones that are supposed to be in charge, Pastor George. All right, I'm going to read the rest of the chapter. I'm going to continue to talk. If you need to go and scoot, it's like 10 after. It's up to you. I hope you stay with me to the end. We're almost done.
You thought you were finishing?
Yeah, I know. I'm going to finish tonight, no matter what. But the fact that we are here is because you guys love the word like I do, and we can talk about these things. This is no. All right, don't interrupt me anymore. Be quiet. All right, 13 to 25. All right, let's finish. Then the whole congregation sent word and spoke to the sons of Benjamin who were at the rock of Rimmon, and proclaimed peace to them. Benjamin returned at that time, and they gave them the women whom they had kept alive from the women of Jabesh Gilead. Yet they were not enough for them. And the people were sorry for Benjamin because the Lord had made a breach in the tribes of Israel. Then the elders of the congregation said, "What shall we do for wives for those who are left, since the women are destroyed out of Benjamin?" And they said, "There must be an inheritance for the survivors of Benjamin, that a tribe may not be blotted out from Israel." but we cannot give them wives of our daughters. For the sons of Israel had sworn, saying, Cursed is he who gives a wife to Benjamin. So they said, Behold, there is a feast of the Lord from year to year in Shiloh, which is on the north side of Bethel, on the east side of the highway that goes up from Bethel to Shechem, and on the south side of Lebonah. And they commanded the sons of Benjamin, saying, Go lie in wait in the vineyards, and watch, and behold, if the daughters of Shiloh come out to take part in these dances, then you shall come out of the vineyards, and each of you shall catch his wife from the daughters of Shiloh, and go to the land of Benjamin.
Is that how you do it?
These people are so messed up, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
They needed some
Run
counseling.
out of the vineyards.
That's how you do it?
Yeah, that's how you catch a wife. That's giving you a little idea.
I think West Virginia, they do this too.
So obviously,
Yeah, I know, right?
the slow women got married.
No, I'm not going to say anything. We have young people here. It shall come about when their fathers or their brothers come to complain to us that we shall say to them, Give them to us voluntarily, because we did not take for each man of Benjamin a wife in battle, nor did you give them to them, else you would now be guilty. The sons of Benjamin did so, and took wives according to their number from those who danced, whom they carried away. And they went and returned to their own inheritance, and rebuilt the cities, and lived in them. The sons of Israel departed from there at that time, every man to his tribe and family, and each one of them went out from there to his inheritance. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes.
The end.
The end. It's like a bedtime story there. All right, let's see if I can get through here. Speed round.
And that's why the Benjaminites are such good dancers.
Yeah. Those Benjamite women. In verse 13, the men of Israel finally make contact with the 600 Benjamite men at the rock of Rimmon, and they make peace with their brothers. Convinced that this was not a final trap, the Benjamites joined the Israelites at Shiloh, where they were given 400 virgins as wives. But we have a math problem. There were still 200 Benjamites who did not get a wife. And let me just say this, because, Ro, I'm going to answer your question a little bit more. The 400 virgins themselves, we're not focused on the fact that they have not had relations with men, but the fact that they would have been identifiable first, and that they were of age to have babies. Okay, so this would have been any women that were here that would have been of age of childbearing age. Okay, so that's the idea here. So hopefully there was 400. Yeah, they had to, I wonder how they did that. They drew lots. Faster ones got it. Yeah, the quick 400 and the slow 200, right? So there were still 200 Benjamins. They didn't get a wife. So they came up with another ingenious plan, right? There was a festival. Now, it could be the festival, the Feast of Tabernacles. It doesn't say. Or it could be a local Shiloh feast that occurred every year, okay? Which may be more the case. So each year they had this festival, and apparently lots of unmarried women attended. Dancing was part of the festivities. So the 200 men were told to hide in the nearby vineyards during the festival, and when the virgin girls stepped out onto the dance floor, they were told to quickly spring into action and grab a girl for themselves, kind of like that. Then they were instructed to race back to their own tribal territory and live happily ever after. That's how it went. All right, everybody got it? Live happily ever after. Grab your girl and go. For those who are not too sure, this was kidnapping. The tribes knew that they would have to handle a large group of angry fathers and brothers who would want justice for their stolen daughters and sisters, right? They knew that this was going to come down the road, that they had to deal with these guys. So they decided to tell these men to be calm and not overreact, to convince them that this was for all the good of all Israel, that their women were stolen. They were basically told, be team players here, right? Be a team player. It's for the good of everybody. Besides, here's the kicker, they wouldn't be guilty of breaking their vow to God to not give their daughters to any Benjamites, because the girls weren't given, they were kidnapped. Therefore, you're off the hook. That's what that verse means.
Yep.
That's what they say at the end,
Oy.
right? Right, here we go again. So they didn't break this vow. They're off the hook. You just simply chose not to retrieve them. That's how we'll leave it, right? I mean, verse 22 shows us that these vows were not pious acts of men done in faith. Rather, they were doctrines or traditions of men established and driven by culture. Note, some vows can actually be pious, okay? Not all vows are bad, and not all traditions are bad. Traditions can be very good, even in the church. But anytime we see in the church man-made doctrines and traditions that supersede Christian behaviors and conduct, then we have a repeat of verse 22, except in 2021. Here are some man-made doctrines, and I pulled these off a website, and there's so many of them. I just pulled a couple of them. They might be goofy, but here's some man-made doctrines that in and of themselves, they're not bad, right? There's nothing wrong with them, but when taken as gospel, they can be abused. Only the King James Version should be used in public worship.
Amen.
All right?
Amen.
2, if you preach or serve at the Lord's table, you must wear a tie. Here's another one we broke. It's wrong to have a kitchen in the church building. That's an old one.
You know, they need to repaint the Last Supper, put a tie on everybody.
Yeah, that is true. Here's another one. No women may teach Bible class in which there are boys and teenagers that have been baptized. Old tradition, right?
Been baptized?
That have been baptized.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Because in some church they hold this. It was an article I found in a church who does not bind on what God has not bound. I don't know if I wrote that right. It doesn't make sense. A church who does not bind on others what God has not bound. I think it should be others. So Jesus dealt with this issue with the Pharisees, right? Who held their oral traditions over appropriate godly conduct and compassion. I was going to read Matthew 15, 1 through 8. So in Matthew 15, 1 through 8, maybe you can just read that on your own. The Pharisees, right? The brood of vipers, right? They found a loophole, basically, in the law. And they, right, no, it was a loophole because basically, instead of taking care of some of their widows, parents, right? They were saying that they were dedicating all this money, and it was to God. Korban, right? Korban. And so they didn't have to fulfill that part of the law because they gave it all to God, so they can't give it to their parents.
So their parents were paupers.
Right.
Because they dedicated everything they had to God.
Right. So Jesus calls them out because, even the Pharisees, in the Pharisaical teachings, as pious as everybody thought the Pharisees were, they found loopholes all the time. Like the Pharisees, the leaders of the 11 tribes found a loophole to solve the issue for the last 200 men. The bottom line is that it was a real bad sign that these men had to repeatedly find ways to satisfy one vow without breaking another. How godly could their behavior have been? And how pleased could God have been with the behavior of these men? Not very. In the end, all 600 Benjamites went back to their territory, rebuilt their cities, and repopulated them with their offspring so that the tribe avoided extinction. Now, I want to point out something that you may not think about concerning the tribe of Benjamin moving forward. The offspring from these unions would now be of mixed heritage. The 400 maidens from Jabesh would have been mostly from the tribe of Manasseh, probably some from the tribe of Gad. The other 200 women taken from Shiloh were a combination. If it was a major festival like the Feast of Tabernacles, it would have been a group of a bunch of different women from a bunch of different tribes. That's if this festival was the Feast of Tabernacles. If it was a local yearly festival held by the tribe of Ephraim, then it would have been a mix of Ephraimites, right? So there would have been now mixed blood, so if it was a local festival. So even though the fathers were Benjamites, not one mother had Benjamite blood. Now Israel in and of itself was never a pure race to begin with. For example, Joseph married an Egyptian, so that the tribe of Ephraim and Manasseh had Egyptian blood, right? When you think about it. Israel was quite the melting pot over time. The point is that Jews cannot go back to pure bloodlines and use it for entrance into God's kingdom. For both Jews and Gentile believers alike, it is not in bloodlines that we boast, but in faith and in the true and living God and his Messiah. I believe that God set it up this way so that bloodlines, which are held up really very, very importantly, especially in Middle Eastern culture, that they would never be a factor in his kingdom, right? Bloodlines would never be a factor. God's kingdom runs on spirit and truth. One last thing to point out about these unions and the role they play in futures events, just so you know, if you do you want to read 1 Samuel. As I mentioned before, King Saul was from the city of Gibeah. He was a Benjaminite of mixed blood, an offspring of either the 400 or the 200 slow ones, right? So Saul came from one of those groups. When Ammon threatened the people of Jabesh Gilead in 1 Samuel 11, they turned to Saul for help. The Spirit of God came upon Saul as he called the nation together to defend Jabesh. But there was also a close blood tie between the tribe of Benjamin and the people of Jabesh. Probably some of their people went up there to repopulate that city. So they were relatives. That's why they called Saul to come and help them out. Because we're going to see blood ties now between Jabesh and the tribe of Benjamin. When Saul died in battle and his body was hung on the walls of Bethshan, it was the men of Jabesh Gilead who valiantly recovered his body and those of his sons. They did this in gratitude for a young Saul who rescued them from the hands of Ammon, but also because they were blood relatives of Saul as well, more than likely, right? So we'll see that in 1 Samuel as you read that. That's the deal with the Jabesh and with King Saul and why there was a blood tie there. The final verse in the book of Judges is fitting as it ends it by saying, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Beloved, we are reliving the time of the judges. We're reliving that time. You can see it in the culture. We are headed down the same path. Like the days of Othniel, Samson, Jephthah, and Ehud, many Christians today are doing only what is right in their own eyes. The infallible standards that God has revealed in his word are being challenged. We know where this path leads. It leads us to a point in human history where, unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. Matthew 24:22. God will cut those days short. And in Psalm 2:6, he says that he will install his king on his holy mountain, our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. When the true king reigns, the world will finally have the perfect ruler who will rule the nations with a rod of iron. He will be exactly what we need. Amen. The end. Any questions, any comments? I know we're going late, but does anybody have anything about the last 13 verses of Judges? What I planned on doing was actually have each one of you come up with an application yourselves or just one basic observation. But we did so much observating, especially like the past couple of weeks. We've had so many observations while we were running late, or running long. But it's been great. But does anybody want to make any comments about the book, observations, or maybe throw out a quick application?
I just want to say that loving this book explains so many of the other things that happen later on in the Bible that necessity.
Right. My purpose for that was really to bring in the culture and the language and bring that in. So I mean, if you can understand the book of Judges, you can understand 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, the Kings, you know. Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for saying so. It's your support and the love and the generosity and the encouragement that's allowed me to be up here for 22 weeks and do this. Pastor Chaz can tell you how nervous I was the first weeks. I was pacing up and down, you know. I'd be driving the car here. And then at the end here, I'm driving the car and I'm excited to see you guys every week. So I've gotten more comfortable up here and hopefully that shows in the teaching. But I hope it's a blessing for you guys, as the book was a blessing to me. When I studied this book, I said, I want to make sure that you feel that when I teach, how much I enjoyed the book. Go ahead.
Or you want me to say something?
Yeah, absolutely. We can't end if you don't say anything, so I won't.
Well,
You can't.
Oh, come on.
No, I love it. You're my favorite student. Don't tell anybody else.
This was an absolute fabulous study, and I want to thank you for all the effort that you put in, because it really showed, and I think, I personally learned a lot, just about the times, the people, and like you were saying, it's just so, there's nothing new under the sun.
Right.
We're the same people that, we're them. They're
Human
us.
nature is human nature,
Yeah,
and
and
our
without
God
the
doesn't
Lord-
change as well, right?
Yeah, and without the Lord, obviously, these last chapter, they were picking and choosing. That's what we do, right? We pick and choose verses that we want, things that we want,
Right. Absolutely. Good application
you
for
know, and
this book, right?
yeah. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. We'll see how George does.
Great observations.
You got some competition.
I don't think Pastor George is going to let you talk as much. Not you personally. In general. He doesn't like that as much.
Not too many people pick,
No, I'm just Pastor George, I am totally joking. I'm messing around.
not too many people pick a book like this to teach.
Yeah.
I think you went too fast. I think you need to read
I should have cut it in half, right? Did a half a chapter a week.
I think what amazed me is the contrast between like Abraham, like, who said, okay, if I'll give my son, and because God's promised, if he'll raise another son up, or he'll resurrect my son. And all these people who had like the smallest, not even a grain of faith.
Right. And we were talking about it. It probably started with the priesthood, right? It started at the spiritual leadership that wasn't there, so they weren't really. The national leadership, when Joshua died, that was really a big hole in a vacuum that created.
We're planning on taking DG's notes and publishing a commentary. So it's gonna be a few weeks.
It would be a very local commentary for the ones who love. Yeah, we'll see if I can put it together. I'll editing. I'll have my editors help me out.
Stuff that I missed,
What's that?
the stuff that I missed, will I read it there?
Well, I can give you in book form instead of carrying that out. It would be like in a little book form, so it would be a little, and you can just have the book. Might be better for you, maybe. Yeah. So that'll be good. That'll be, yeah. I'll be working hard on that.
The two initials, it's DG.
Any other comments or anything, observations? Anything? Great study. Let's close in a word of prayer and thank the Lord. Dear Heavenly Father, that was a wonderful study. You blessed from the beginning, and we have a bunch of Bible enthusiasts that come here and want to learn your word, and it just makes things wonderful and special. And we're going to continue to do that with Pastor George through 1st and 2nd Peter, so I ask your blessing on that study as well. So I just pray for each as they go out tonight. Keep the word close to their hearts and minds for those here and for those who are watching at home. And just thanks again for the study. Thank you for the word, and thank you for the freedom that we have to spend here on these many different nights the church is offering for study, and just have this freedom. And we'll take that until the freedom is taken away from us, Lord. So thanks again for your word. Thank you for all the blessings. And I pray all